little nervous. This is like going on stage.
Yeah.
Hopefully she joins us back. Well, welcome everyone. We are live on YouTube and we are here to introduce survivor Ken Wetcher. And with that, I am going to turn it over to him. We encourage for this particular event to be a conversation. So as we listen to Ken's talk, feel free to place any of your questions, respectful questions, into the YouTube chat, and either myself or one of the moderators will relay it to him during his presentation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ken.
Good morning. It's sort of strange dealing with an audience that I can't see or hear. And so you'll excuse me about my discomfort about that. I actually have a lot of familiarity with public speaking and also with theater, so I like to have that audience sensation directly in front of me. Anyway, so my name is Ken Wetcher. I'll tell you a little bit about myself currently before I go into the Holocaust issues. I live in Naples, Florida. I'm a psychiatrist. I still practice a couple of days a week at telepsychiatry. I used to practice in Houston, Texas for about 30 years near NASA. I had a chance to spend a lot of time with a lot of the engineers and the pilots and people like that in NASA. And that was a very interesting part of my career. Now I want to tell you a little bit about myself growing up, and hopefully that will give you a chance to ask me some questions about what it is that you're interested in knowing in the Holocaust. Certainly nowadays, in this particular moment, if you're following the news, a lot of memories get revived because it's exactly the same area that was impacted during World War II, and a lot of the same things that are happening to the people today were happening to people then, and obviously, I'm sure, as you know from your history, a lot of worse things were happening as well. I've always had some questions about whether I technically qualify as a survivor, and fortunately, I've had communication with the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and they said, yes, definitely I do, and was fortunate enough to be there at their 20th anniversary celebration, and which was very, very amazing. If you ever get a chance to go to Washington to see that museum, I strongly recommend it. I was born in Siberia, Russia. And the way that happened was that my parents lived in Poland, in a very small town, I guess it's called a shtetl, called Tarnogrod, and not far from a larger town called Łódź. It's spelled L-O-D-Z, but it's pronounced Łódź in Polish. They were there, and in 1939, the Germans invaded Poland. And when they did that, they occupied the area that my parents lived, which is fairly close to the Russian border. They started performing some atrocities there. And after about 6 weeks, they announced that they had made an error in terms of the map. At that time, if you remember your history, Russia and Germany were allies, and the Germans announced that actually it's the Russians who should be occupying that particular part of Poland. So they withdrew, the Russians came in. Excuse me, just a minute. The Russians weren't as bad as the Germans were. They weren't killing people randomly. They weren't rounding up Jews and sending them anywhere. Things continued for a while until about 6 weeks later, when there, in fact, was another announcement by the Russians this time that no, the original map was correct, and it should be the Germans to occupy. And when that was announced, my parents, along with many other people, decided to leave. So just like the Ukrainians are leaving now. They left and walked across the border, following the Russian army, walked across the border into Russia. My father's parents, my grandparents, accompanied them, but then partway they said they were just too old, too tired, couldn't really do it, and returned back to Poland. While we, not we, my parents went into Russia. Those grandparents were murdered by the Nazis, as were my mother's parents, murdered. But my mother's mother, my grandmother, and my mother's stepfather, no, I'm sorry, my mother's real father, were murdered. I'm getting confused about that. I'm sorry. It is my mother's mother were killed. My mother's father had actually divorced my grandmother and had moved to Britain sometime earlier. So he remained alive, and there's a story to that, which I hopefully will get to. Anyway, my parents got into Russia because they were illegal aliens. They were sent to a slave labor camp in Siberia, where my father, who was a chemical engineer, had studied the Sorbonne in Paris. My father was made to be work in the timber area, cutting down trees, and my mother did some other work along those lines. Somewhere along the line, my mother got pregnant, and I was born. I was sent. I was sent to. My mother was sent someplace to a nice hospital where she was able to get some food, because when she first started going into some false labor, they took her to the hospital, and before that, they weren't giving her ration of food because she wasn't able to work. So that all worked out well. I see somebody asked a question about where I went, and I'll get to that in a moment. Thank you. There we were in the slave labor camp, and at some point, my father was inducted in an army of Polish nationals. It was a Russian army of Polish nationals. By that time, Russia had joined the Allies and was on the side of the United States. And so he was inducted into an army of Polish nationals that was supposed to go to the African front. At the same time, my mother and I were released from the slave labor camp and ended up in Turkestan and Uzbekistan. And my father was going to Africa when they had to pass through what was then Palestine, which is now Israel, and he defected, stayed in Israel. His brother had already been there before, and started a new life. He didn't know if we were alive. We didn't know if he was alive. in 1945, after the war, which sort of gets to the question that was being asked, in that at that time, my the Russians allowed all the Jews who had entered in the way that we did the freedom to leave. They gave us a 6-month window. We went in cattle cars, we walked, we marched, did a lot of things to get out of Russia. And my mother and I ended up, along with my aunt and uncle, in a displaced persons camp in Germany. It was a town called Bad Reichenhall, which was a spa town. And they had the U.S. military had appropriated a lot of the spa buildings for the displaced persons. So that's where we were. My mother and I and my aunt and uncle, we were there immediately after the Holocaust. Then again, we didn't know anything about anybody being there or not being there. And we were hoping to somehow or other get in touch with some family. And then my father's cousin, Milton Wetcher, was a major in the U.S. forces who occupied the West German sector. And he was going around, like many other military personnel from America, was going around from camp to camp, trying to locate family, people that he knew. Since his name was Wetcher, they had changed it from Wetcher to Wetcher. He sort of recognized our name, and he created the loop where he contacted his family in the U.S., who had been in touch with my father in Israel, and he was finally able to communicate with my mother and realize that we were alive and that he was alive. And he wanted to bring us to Israel, but he couldn't do so because it was under the British mandate in those days. Britain ruled that area and didn't allow any Jews to migrate. If you ever seen there was a movie, I'm blanking on the name of the movie, but it was all about that particular experience with a big Exodus. The name of the movie is Exodus, about a ship of people who was turned back because they were full of Jews trying to Germany. Nonetheless, he ended up being sponsored by his aunt and uncle to come to the United States, which he did. And after he was there for a year, he was able to bring us to the U.S. And that's how I got to America. I was fortunate. My parents were loving, caring parents. I was the only child, and so they supported me, got everything, did everything they could for me to get an education. I ended up going to medical school and eventually becoming a psychiatrist. Spent a couple of years in the Air Force, stationed in Houston, and I lived there for 30 years. And then more recently, well, actually, about 20 years ago, moved here to Naples when I stopped working full-time. Although I still work a couple of days a week doing telepsychiatry. I'd like to open it up to questions in a few minutes, but I'd like to show you a few photographs. So, Steve, I'm going to share my screen, and then after I do that, you'll help me unshare it when I'm finished.
Most certainly.
Yeah, so I'm going to share this screen here. And so here's a photo of my mother and myself and my aunt, my father's sister, when we were in Siberia.
Just a quick interruption. Be sure to press the share screen button. We're not seeing anything quite yet. There we go.
There you
Perfect.
go. You're seeing that now. And I didn't have these photos in any particular order, so it may be, this is a photograph of my mother and I in the displaced persons camp in Bad Reichenhall with my uncle, my cousin, Milton, when he found us there. This just shows my citizenship papers. My parents became citizens when I was about 12 years old, which automatically made me a citizen, but I wasn't happy with that. So I wrote a letter to President Eisenhower and said, I want to be a citizen. And lo and behold, I actually got a response and was told that I could go ahead and get full naturalization like anybody else. And that made me very happy. And to this day, I'm still very proud to be an American citizen. Let's see, I'm going to go back. This is my green card. This is when I first came to America, and I got this. I don't know what the current green cards look like, but this is the one that they gave me. This is a story I was going to share with you. This is my grandfather. You remember I was getting really confused about grandfathers. Of course, I didn't know any of my extended family because they were all murdered in Poland. But this is my grandfather. This was the only picture I ever had of him. And about 4 years ago, having done 23andMe, I got a message through 23andMe from this very attractive young woman saying, I think we may be related. I was a little skeptical, you know, there are so many scams going on right now, but she gave me enough information to make me wonder whether perhaps this was true. And sure enough, it turns out that she was the great granddaughter of this gentleman, my grandfather. He had moved to England and started a new family and hadn't told anybody. He had told people that he had been divorced, but hadn't told anybody about having any children. And so I got together through her with her mother and her aunt, who were the grandchildren of my grandfather, who I had never known before. And we ended up visiting them in London. They visited us here in the States, and it's been a really wonderful reintegration of family. And this is my uncle, my mother's brother. He was about 6 years old when their father left for London, when my mother was about 1 year old. He stayed in Poland and was murdered. And he had a large lumber yard. And when the Nazis occupied, he was hidden out by some people who had been his friends, customers. And then as the war was getting down to an end, when people were realizing that the Germans were going to lose, apparently some townspeople, people didn't want to give that property back, came in and killed them all, chopped up my uncle and my aunt and their 2 children. I only learned in detail about that much later. This is me again when I was very little. This is when we were already in the displaced persons camp. My mother is to my right. This is my uncle Sidney and my aunt Miriam and my aunt Shirley. Sidney and Miriam were married. Shirley was not married at the time, and we were fortunate enough to be in the same displaced persons camp. So, Stephen, if you can go ahead and stop my screen sharing. I still haven't been able to figure out how to do that. And I can open it up to further questions.
All right, so we have the screen sharing down. Any questions from our YouTube live audience? We'll give a couple minutes, and if there are no questions, then we'll end it out for this session. But so far, I just want to take the opportunity to thank you for sharing your story with us today. It's very important for us to keep this in mind in light of recent things going on around the world. There's the saying that history tends to repeat itself. And so that's why we do these events, is so we don't repeat the actions of the Holocaust. And hopefully we continue living as peacefully as we can. I do have a question that came in. Hi, Ken. Have you gotten a chance to read the graphic novel Mouse?
It was a long time ago, and so I haven't really don't remember it very well. So, but I certainly know about it, and it's got. I know about the fact that somebody someplace tried to censor it. But I do need to go and look it up again. Just getting back to what Stephen said, I do think it's very important to acknowledge the fact that right now in the same exact area of the world, the similar things are going on. You don't have the slave labor camps, you don't have the extermination camps, you don't have any of those things quite yet. But look, you've got people who are supposed to be leaving in a corridor to escape, and they're being bombed. And every time the Russians are saying that they're going to allow some people to leave, it seems to be a ruse. We want them on the road so we can go shoot them. So it's really sad that these kinds of things keep on repeating throughout the world. One of the important things to remember about the Holocaust is not just the history, not just the fact that it happened so long ago, but to remember that these things keep on happening. We've had Rwanda, we've had so many parts of the world have had. Right now in Russia, in China, you've got the Uyghurs. So many parts of the world have had these kinds of atrocities done to people for no other reason than they look different, sound different, have different last names, whatever it is. And it's just a really travesty that we cannot learn. And it's amazing that sometimes people think they know and they don't know. I just recently was amazed by a news report. Someone who said he has been a news reporter for 25 years. And he was amazed at the cohesiveness of the Ukrainian people and how firmly they stood against Russia, and that this has never happened in history. Well, of course, it did happen in history. If you know anything about World War II, the United States, people were cohesive, they were firm, they were strong, they were together, they understood that they had to live in with some stress and some duress in order to stay behind the process. It took a while because originally, for a while, there was a lot of controversy. But once we got into the war, we were firm with it. The British were firm with it. And yet this news reporter who had been reporting for 25 years didn't remember that people can get together. And we have to get together in order to be humane to others. And if that's the most important message, I think that I can provide in this kind of a forum.
Coming in from the chat, you do have some more questions. We have, hi Ken, can you share some of the struggles your mother went through to have a child while in a slave labor camp?
Wow, all righty. I asked her, my mother passed away some time ago, but I asked her those questions frequently. So literally, first of all, she had to work. When she was pregnant, at some point when she couldn't work, she didn't get any food rations. And so my people around her had to share their food rations so that she could eat. And she was fortunate going into false labor, that she got into a hospital a little earlier. And since it was so far away, she couldn't be brought back. And that's why she was able to eat. But I always asked her that, why would you want to have a baby in that situation? And she said, I'm so glad that I did. It was very important. So that was a struggle. But then later on, it was even more of a struggle, because when they were released from the slave labor camp and they were in Turkestan, we were in Turkestan and Uzbekistan, she had to struggle. She had brought some stuff with her that she was able to sell, and in some way she was able to get that. But there were times when she literally went into the fields and stole oats from horses' feed to make soup out of for us, in order for us to eat. My uncle had figured out a way to get a loom, and was able to actually weave some cloth and sell that. It was the Soviet Union at the time. You weren't allowed to have any private businesses. And I, at the age of about 4, was his lookout. I stood outside the shed to make sure that no police were coming to arrest him. So it was a struggle, just as you see now in Ukraine. You see the families leaving with just whatever they could carry at the most. Hopefully nowadays you have bank accounts that might be able to be accessed other places, which we didn't have anything like that then.
Another question that came in was, Ken, what type of school did you go to?
As a child in Uzbekistan, I was in a nursery school. I didn't bring up one of those pictures, but that's because it was one of those big class pictures, and you wouldn't be able to see me anyway. So I was in a nursery school there. The only schooling that I had otherwise was what's called cheder. It was a Jewish school, and that really wasn't an official school. There would be a rabbi who would teach, and we did that. When I came to the U.S., I didn't speak any English at all. My primary language was Yiddish, which is sort of a combination of German and Hebrew, and written in the Hebrew alphabet. I was 7 years old, and you learn pretty quickly from other kids. And so I started school there weren't any special classes for children with second languages, but I just learned, and then eventually continued. I did go to a parochial Jewish school called a yeshiva during most of my primary school education, but then in high school, junior high school and high school, I returned to the regular public school system. I don't know how far you want me to go. After that, I went to CCNY, City College in New York, and then I went to Downstate Medical Center to get my MD degree. And so that's basically my schooling, and then of course internship and residency.
Wonderful, thank you for that. Are there any other questions out there that you have for our speaker today? I know that there are a lot of comments. There were some clapping emojis within the chat, that there is an agreement that peace has to be restored to the world, prayers to the Ukraine, of course. Any other comments or questions from our live audience? keeping an eye on the chat. Well, hopefully, I was just thinking, looking at the one comment of the graphic novel Mouse, hopefully you'll be able to order a copy of that. I had read somewhere, I believe, that it was getting significantly more difficult to get a copy of it. So
Well,
may want to buy one up real soon.
I think I'll do that, yeah.
And I know that it is a set. It's more than just one issue.
Mhm.
Well, we have a thank you very much in the chat. And I certainly agree with that. So please look out at our schedule. It is linked within the description below this video for our upcoming on-campus events today on the Lee campus in Fort Myers. For the rest of this week, we will have primarily virtual events that you can join either through Zoom proper as a meeting or with us here on YouTube Live. And on behalf of the Dr. Talbot Spivak Holocaust Memorial Week Planning Committee, I certainly thank you, Ken, for sharing your experiences with us and speaking with us today. And with that, I am going to stop our live.